A homeless girl saved a powerful landowner from a deadly ambush. When she discovered the truth behind the attack, she was left in shock. Family secrets came to light and their destinies became intertwined in ways no one could have predicted. A story of courage, redemption, and love. Get ready. Because this story will touch your heart, subscribe to the channel, leave your like on this video, and comment where in America you're watching from. The scent of distant rain hung in the air as Hope clutched the worn fabric of her skirt, her calloused fingers digging into the rough weave. Her eyes, the deep green of mesquite leaves shading her small adobe house, swept across the vast fields that once belonged to her family. Now 3 winters after her husband's unexpected departure, all she had left was a small plot of land surrounding the house and memories of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. The sky, painted in hues of orange and purple by the setting sun, mirrored itself in puddles left by the morning's rain. Autumn arrived earlier that year in the small town of Oakhaven, bringing with it the foreboding of a harsh winter. Hope pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and breathed deeply, feeling the damp, cool air fill her lungs. The smell of wet earth mingled with the faint fragrance of the last wildflowers clinging to life along the roadside. "Mama?" 11-year-old Lucy's voice was soft as a sparrow's chirp. "The stew is almost ready." Hope turned and saw her daughter standing in the doorway. Lucy had inherited her father's brown hair, but her eyes were identical to her mother's, large, expressive, with a spark of determination that even the hardships of recent years hadn't managed to extinguish. Beside her, 6-year-old little Dylan played with a roughly carved wooden horse, the last gift their father had given them before leaving for work in the coastal cities, promising to return with enough money to reclaim the land lost to debt. A promise, like so many others, that had dissolved in time like morning mist. "Coming, sweetheart," Hope replied, tucking a stray strand of hair back into her simple bun. Her fingers, marked by years of hard work, lightly touched the silver clasp holding her shawl in place, the only valuable item she still possessed, an heirloom from her grandmother. The small house was warmed by the fire crackling in the wood stove. The adobe walls, coated with a thin layer of lime, reflected the golden light of the flames, creating a cozy atmosphere despite the simplicity. In the center, a dark wooden table worn by time and use held 3 earthenware bowls and a basket of corn tortillas Hope had made that morning. Lucy stirred the vegetable stew with a wooden spoon, her face focused on the task. She had taken on many responsibilities since her father's departure, becoming almost a little adult. Hope felt a mix of pride and sadness watching her. Pride in the strength and maturity she displayed, sadness at seeing her forced to grow up so early. "That smells delicious," Hope commented, approaching to check the contents of the pot. Vegetables from her garden, some mushrooms Dylan had found at the edge of the woods, a handful of herbs. It wasn't much, but it would be enough for the night. "Mr. Harrison stopped by today," Lucy said, avoiding her mother's gaze. "He said the deadline is in 2 weeks. Hope felt a knot forming in her throat. Harrison Blackwood, the owner of almost all the surrounding land, had bought her debts from the bank a year ago. Since then, he'd been pressuring her to sell the small remaining property, the only inheritance she could leave her children. "Don't worry about that now," she replied, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Let's eat. Dylan, wash your hands, sweetie." As they ate the steaming stew, little Dylan excitedly recounted discovering a bird's nest near the creek. Hope listened, nodding, but her mind wandered among her worries. Winter was approaching. Their wood supply was low. The roof needed urgent repairs, and now Harrison's ultimatum. Through the small window, she could see the first star of the night appearing in the rapidly darkening sky. She felt a deep weariness settle on her shoulders, but at the same time, a quiet determination grew in her chest. She wouldn't let him take the last piece of land her ancestors had cultivated for generations. She would find a way to resist, to rebuild, to transform that land back into a thriving home for her children. As the children finished eating, Hope looked at her hands, calloused with short nails and stains of dirt that never completely came out, no matter how much she scrubbed. Hands that knew how to plant, harvest, weave, mend, heal wounds, and caress hair on stormy nights. Maybe they weren't the delicate hands she'd dreamed of in her youth, but they were strong. And at that moment, looking at her children's faces in the firelight, Hope knew she would need all that strength to face what was to come. The wall clock, the only valuable item they hadn't sold, ticked steadily at 8 o'clock, its sound echoing in the silence of the night. Outside, the wind began to blow more fiercely, heralding the arrival of the storm. The rain had been falling incessantly for 3 days, turning the roads into rivers of mud and keeping Hope and the children confined inside the small house. The roof, with its several broken tiles, couldn't completely contain the water, which dripped into buckets strategically placed on the floor. The rhythmic sound of the drops added to the crackling of the wood in the stove and the whistling of the wind seeping through the cracks in the poorly sealed windows. Hope sat by the makeshift fire, sewing in the candlelight. Her fingers moved skillfully through the fabric, mending one of Dylan's blankets that had torn during one of his explorations in the woods. Lucy, sitting on the worn mat, read an old book with yellowed pages, a seafaring adventure story that had belonged to her father. Little Dylan slept wrapped in a blanket, his serene face contrasting with the chaos of the storm raging outside. A noise at the door made Hope lift her head. Frowning, she set the blanket aside and walked hesitantly to the entrance. She wasn't expecting visitors in that weather, especially at that time of night. Opening the door, she found Sophia Perez soaked to the bone, shivering under a drenched shawl. Sophia was the daughter of one of the region's most prosperous farmers, who maintained a cordial, albeit distant, relationship with Hope. "Sophia, come in for goodness sake, you're drenched," Hope exclaimed, pulling the young woman inside. Sophia, in her mid-20s, was the opposite of Hope in many ways. Where Hope had skin tanned by the sun and work, Sophia displayed the protected whiteness of the privileged. Her hands were soft, her blonde hair always neatly arranged, except at that moment when it hung in wet strands around her pale face. "Forgive me for the hour, Hope," Sophia said, her voice trembling as much as her body. "My horse got spooked by a lightning strike and bolted. I ended up losing my way in the storm, and I only recognized your house when I was almost past it." Hope led the girl to the fire, moved aside the buckets collecting water from the leaky roof, and helped her remove her soaked shawl. Lucy, watching the scene with curiosity, got up to find a dry blanket. "I'll make you some tea to warm you up," Hope said, already moving towards the stove. Sophia looked around the interior of the house with a gaze Hope couldn't decipher. It wasn't exactly disdain, perhaps just discomfort or surprise. Most of the region's inhabitants knew Hope's situation, but few had been inside her house in recent years, since financial difficulties had forced her into an isolation that was both economic and social. "You're very kind to take me in," Sophia commented, accepting the blanket Lucy offered. "My father will be worried. I only went out to deliver a message to Mrs. Olivia and should have been back before nightfall." Hope nodded, putting water to boil. "The storm worsened quickly. It's not safe for you to return tonight. You can stay here and leave in the morning when the rain subsides." An uncomfortable silence settled between them. Hope could feel Sophia's eyes scanning the room, noticing the worn furniture, the peeling walls, the patches in the curtains. She felt a pang of shame, immediately followed by a wave of irritation with herself. There was no reason to be ashamed of her poverty. She was an honest woman facing adversity with dignity. "My father mentioned that Harrison Blackwood is interested in your land," Sophia said suddenly, as she accepted the cup of tea Hope offered. Hope felt her stomach clench. "Yes, he made that quite clear. They say he intends to expand his plantations to the river," Sophia continued, blowing on the hot tea. "My father thinks that, well, that it would be wise to accept his offer. He says Mr. Blackwood is being generous, considering the circumstances." Hope stiffened, feeling her face flush. The circumstances Sophia referred to were obviously her debts, her status as a single woman with 2 children to raise, the deterioration of her property. Blackwood's generosity consisted of offering an amount that would barely cover her debts, leaving her homeless and without a future. "I appreciate your father's concern," Hope replied, keeping her voice controlled despite the indignation growing in her chest. "But this land has been in my family for 4 generations. I don't intend to sell it, especially for a value so far below what it's really worth." Sophia seemed uncomfortable with the firmness in Hope's voice. "I didn't mean to offend you, just everyone knows it's been hard for you since he passed, and with the children." Hope looked at Lucy, who pretended to be engrossed in her book, but clearly heard every word. Dylan was still asleep, oblivious to the tension growing in the room. "The children are well cared for," she replied, more sharply than she intended. Softening her tone, she added, "I appreciate your concern, Sophia. I really do. But I have a plan." It was a lie, or almost. Hope had fragments of ideas, possibilities she hadn't managed to fully organize, but under Sophia's pitying gaze, she felt the need to assert her autonomy, her ability to solve her own problems. "What kind of plan?" Sophia asked, genuinely curious. Hope hesitated. "I intend to diversify what I produce. There's a growing market for medicinal herbs and tinctures. I started cultivating some rarer species last year, and the results were promising." She didn't mention that most of the seedlings had died during the summer drought, nor that she didn't have the resources to invest properly in that project. What little she knew about medicinal herbs came from her grandmother's teachings and an old book inherited from her, full of margin notes. Sophia nodded, but Hope sensed the doubt in her eyes. "It's an interesting idea, but it requires investment, contacts." "I have knowledge," Hope replied, lifting her chin slightly. "What I lack in resources, I compensate for with experience." Another silence settled between them, less hostile, but still laden with unspoken things. Outside, the storm seemed to intensify, the wind howling like a wounded animal. Lucy finally closed her book and got up. "I'll prepare a place for Sophia to sleep," she announced, with a maturity that made Hope's heart ache. When the girl left, Sophia leaned slightly forward. "Hope, I didn't come here to judge your situation. In fact, I greatly admire your strength. Few would have resisted like you, alone, for so long." Hope felt the sincerity in the young woman's words, and something inside her softened. "Thank you, Sophia. It's not always easy to maintain pride when everything around you seems to crumble." "Pride is sometimes all we have left," Sophia replied, with a wisdom surprising for her age. "But it can also be too heavy a burden to carry alone." Hope reflected on those words as she watched the flames dancing in the stove. Pride had been both her sustenance and her obstacle in recent years. She had refused offers of help, isolated herself more and more, determined to prove she could overcome difficulties on her own. But at what cost? She looked at little Dylan, sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the worries that kept his mother awake night after night. She thought of Lucy, taking on responsibilities far beyond her age. Was her pride serving them or only herself? The rain continued to fall, relentlessly, and another tile came loose somewhere on the roof, increasing the rhythm of the drops falling into one of the buckets. Hope realized that maybe it was time to reevaluate her choices, to consider paths she had discarded out of pride or fear. Not for herself, but for the two little beings who depended on her for much more than just survival. The morning arrived with a different clarity, almost blinding after days of overcast skies. The storm had passed during the early hours, leaving behind a washed and bright world, with puddles of water reflecting the crystalline blue of the sky like small mirrors scattered across the ground. Sophia left at dawn, mounted on her horse, which, surprisingly, had returned alone to the makeshift shed next to the house during the night. She thanked Hope sincerely for her hospitality, and even invited Lucy and Dylan to visit her father's farm someday, a gesture Hope received with a mix of gratitude and distrust. Now, with the sun already high in the sky, Hope walked around the property, assessing the damage caused by the storm. The small barn had lost part of its roof, the garden was partially flooded, and the creek that cut through the eastern end of her land had overflowed, depositing mud and debris on the bank. Dylan followed closely behind, joyfully jumping over the puddles, while Lucy checked the chickens in the small coop. It was as she approached the creek that Hope noticed something strange. The water, normally crystalline, now showed a reddish coloration, as if it had been stained with clay. Even more curious were the small, shiny fragments that glittered in the sun, embedded in the freshly deposited mud on the banks. Hope knelt on the bank of the creek, ignoring the dampness that immediately soaked the edge of her skirt. With careful fingers, she picked up one of the fragments and examined it in the sunlight. She wasn't knowledgeable about minerals or precious stones, but there was something about that small piece of rock that seemed valuable, different from the ordinary pebbles that populated the creek bed. "What's that, Mama?" Dylan asked, crouching beside her and watching with curious eyes. "I'm not sure," Hope replied, turning the fragment between her fingers. The sunlight revealed golden and reddish veins on its surface. "It looks like the flood brought something from the mountains." The mountains she referred to were visible in the distance, majestic and imposing against the horizon. Local stories spoke of riches hidden in their depths, gold, silver, precious stones, but mining attempts had never been successful in that region, and gradually the rumors were forgotten in favor of safer and more productive activities, such as agriculture. Hope put the fragment in her apron pocket and continued examining the damage around her. There was a lot of work to do before she could consider the meaning of that discovery. The roof needed to be repaired, the garden saved, the animals fed. However, throughout the day as she worked under the autumn sun, her mind returned to the small fragment in her pocket and the possibilities it represented. In the evening, after the children had fallen asleep, Hope sat at the kitchen table with a lamp lit and took the fragment out of her pocket. Under the yellowish light, it seemed even more extraordinary, with reflections that varied from deep red to gold. She then remembered a very old book she had inherited from her grandfather, kept in a box under her bed along with a few other sentimental possessions that had survived the difficult years. The book was a mineralogy manual, with hand-drawn illustrations and margin notes written by her grandfather, who had worked as an advisor to a mining company in his youth before settling down as a farmer. Hope had never paid much attention to that volume, considering it merely a family heirloom with no practical use in her life as a farmer. Now, however, she leafed through the pages with renewed interest, looking for something that resembled the fragment she had found. It was almost at the end of the book that she found an illustration that seemed to correspond. A reddish mineral with golden veins, identified as a rare variation of cinnabar, known locally as Earth's blood because of its intense coloration. Her grandfather's notes indicated that cinnabar was mainly valued as a source of mercury, but that this specific variation, found only in certain mountainous regions, also contained traces of gold and other precious minerals. It was extremely rare and therefore valuable not only for industry, but also for collectors and jewelers. Hope felt her heart quicken. Could it be possible that the floods had exposed a deposit of that mineral on her land? Or was it just an isolated occurrence, brought by the current from somewhere distant in the mountains? The next morning, before dawn even broke, Hope was on her feet. She left a note for Lucy explaining that she needed to check something at the creek and that she would return soon. She bundled up against the morning chill and went out, following the course of the creek towards its origins, closer to the mountains. The path was difficult, especially after the storm. At some points, the creek had altered its course, creating new channels between the rocks. Hope walked carefully, attentively observing the creek bed and its banks. The farther she got from home, the more intense the reddish coloration of the water became, and the more frequent the shiny fragments among the stones. After almost 2 hours of walking, she found what seemed to be the source. A small landslide on a hillside had exposed a vein of reddish rock that was now partially submerged by the creek. The current, strengthened by the storm, was slowly eroding the rock, dragging fragments downstream to her property. Hope examined the finding with a mix of excitement and apprehension. If what she had found was truly valuable, it could mean a solution to her financial problems. On the other hand, if the news spread, others might claim rights to the place, or worse, Harrison Blackwood might intensify his efforts to take her land. She collected some larger samples and carefully stored them in her bag. She would need help to confirm the value of her discovery, but she would have to choose her confidants with extreme care. Returning home, she found Lucy feeding the chickens and Dylan playing with his wooden horse in the yard. Upon seeing her, the children ran towards her. "Where were you, Mama?" Lucy asked with an expression that mixed relief and concern. "We were worried. Just exploring the creek," Hope replied, hugging the children. "I needed to check something." That afternoon, after completing the daily chores, Hope sat with the children and shared a simplified version of her discovery. She showed them the shiny fragments and explained that they could be valuable, but that they needed to keep the secret until she was certain. "Like pirate treasure?" Dylan asked, his eyes shining with excitement. Hope smiled. "Something like that, but real, not from stories." Lucy, more perceptive, immediately understood the implications. "Does this mean we won't have to sell our house to Mr. Blackwood?" "I hope so, sweetheart," Hope replied, stroking her daughter's hair. "But first, I need to be sure it's really valuable and figure out how we can use it in the best way." The problem was who to trust. The region was small, and news traveled fast. Anyone she approached might spread the information before Hope even had time to establish her rights to the discovery. She then remembered Edward Miller, an old friend of her father who lived in the nearby town. Edward had been a geology professor before retiring and maintained contacts in academia and industry. More importantly, he was known for his integrity and discretion. They hadn't seen each other in years, but Hope believed that out of consideration for her father's memory, he would help her. It would be a full day's journey to town, but it was a risk she needed to take. If her discovery proved to be valuable, it could not only save her property, but also guarantee a comfortable future for her children. That night, as she watched Lucy and Dylan sleeping, Hope allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. A cautious hope, still fragile but real. The shiny fragments rested in a small box under her pillow, like seeds of a future she was only beginning to imagine. Outside, the sky was clear, revealing a blanket of stars shining with renewed intensity after the storm. Hope remained at the window for a long time, gazing at the horizon where the mountains rose, dark and mysterious against the night sky. Somewhere between those giant shadows and her small house, fate had planted an unexpected opportunity. It remained to be seen if she would have the wisdom and courage needed to transform it into salvation. The town of Riverton buzzed with activity that Saturday morning. The central market, with its colorful stalls of fruits, vegetables, fabrics and crafts, attracted people from all over the region. The air carried a mixture of aromas: freshly baked bread, strong coffee, fresh flowers, and the inevitable smell of dust and horses that characterized any inland urban center. Hope walked purposefully through the crowd, firmly holding the small leather bag where she kept the mineral samples. She had left Lucy and Dylan in the care of Mrs. Gable, an elderly neighbor who lived half a mile from her house. The trip to town had been exhausting. 5 hours of walking followed by a ride in a farmer's wagon heading to the market, but the expectation of confirming the value of her discovery kept her spirits high, despite the physical fatigue. Edward Miller's house was on the east side of town, away from the bustle of the center. It was an old but well-maintained building, with walls yellowed by time, and a small garden where native plants predominated, carefully arranged in geometric beds, the hobby of a retired scientist. Hope hesitated momentarily before knocking on the door. It had been almost 10 years since she had last seen Edward. Her father was still alive the last time they visited the town together, and she was still a young newlywed, full of dreams and plans for the future. So much had changed since then. Would Edward even recognize her? Finally, taking a deep breath, she knocked 3 times. Seconds later, slow footsteps approached, and the door opened, revealing a man with completely white hair, thick-rimmed glasses, and a slightly stooped posture. His eyes, however, retained the bright, inquisitive gleam Hope remembered. "Can I help you?" he asked, adjusting his glasses to see her better. "Professor Miller, I'm Hope, Mateo Ramirez's daughter. I don't know if you remember me, but..." The old man's face lit up with recognition. "Hope, of course I remember you, my goodness, how long? Come in, come in." The interior of the house was exactly as Hope imagined a scholar's residence would be. Walls lined with books, carefully labeled rock and mineral samples on shelves, framed antique maps, and a faint smell of old books and pipe tobacco. Edward led her to a small living room, hastily moving piles of papers from an armchair so she could sit down. "Would you like some tea?" "I just made some," he offered, already heading to the kitchen without waiting for an answer. Hope used the moment alone to organize her thoughts. She didn't want to appear desperate or naive, but she couldn't afford to hesitate either. She needed Edward's experience and contacts. When he returned with 2 steaming cups, Hope was direct. "Professor, I came because I need your help with something important, something that could completely change my situation." Edward nodded, his attentive gaze indicating that he sensed the seriousness of the matter. "I heard about your difficulties after Robert's disappearance. I'm so sorry, dear. Your father was a great friend and he would be heartbroken to see what happened." Hope felt her throat tighten at the mention of her father, but she pushed aside the emotion. "That's why I'm here. I think I found something on my land that could solve my financial problems, but I need someone trustworthy to confirm it." Carefully, she removed the samples from the bag and placed them on the coffee table. Edward leaned forward, his scientific interest immediately aroused. Without saying a word, he got up and went to a shelf, from which he took a small magnifying glass and a set of instruments Hope didn't recognize. For the next few minutes, Edward meticulously examined each sample, occasionally muttering to himself or making notes in a small notebook. Hope watched silently, trying to decipher his expressions. Finally, Edward looked up from the last sample, a barely contained excitement in his gaze. "Where exactly did you find this?" Hope explained how she had found the fragments after the storm, following the creek to its source, and how she had discovered the exposed vein on the hillside. Edward listened attentively, occasionally asking questions about the exact location, the appearance of the surrounding rock, and the extent of the exposed vein. When she finished, he carefully placed the samples back on the table. "Hope what you found is in fact extraordinary," he finally said, with a mix of scientific excitement and caution. "I'm almost certain it's cinnabar mixed with veins of another valuable substance that would need more detailed analysis to identify. The cinnabar itself already has commercial value, but this specific variation could be much more valuable." Hope felt her heart quicken. "So, could this solve my financial problems? Could it save my property?" Edward took off his glasses and carefully wiped them with a handkerchief, a gesture Hope recognized as a habit when he needed time to consider his words. "Potentially, yes, but it's not as simple as just extracting and selling. There are regulations, licenses, legal processes, and more importantly, you would need to establish your rights to the discovery before others try to claim it." Hope's initial euphoria diminished slightly. "How do I do that?" "First, we need to confirm the exact commercial value. I have an old colleague at the university who works with mineral analysis. He could give us a more precise evaluation," Edward said, putting his glasses back on. "After that, it would be necessary to officially register the discovery and possibly negotiate with companies interested in exploitation. All this while maintaining the utmost discretion until your rights are secured." Hope nodded, absorbing the information. It was more complicated than she had imagined, but it still represented hope, something she hadn't had for a long time. How long would it take? Harrison Blackwood's deadline is in less than 2 weeks. Edward frowned. Harrison Blackwood? The owner of Blackwood Manor. Yes, he bought my debts from the bank last year and is pressuring me to sell my property. Interesting, Edward muttered, more to himself than to Hope. Blackwood always had a particular interest in the properties along that valley. Some say it's just because of the quality of the land for cultivation. Others, well, there have always been rumors. What kind of rumors? Hope asked, leaning forward. Edward hesitated. Nothing concrete. Just speculations about why he would be willing to pay above market value for certain properties. Some said there were plans for a large real estate development. Others talked about a dam project, but there was never anything official. Hope connected the dots almost instantly. Do you think he might know about valuable minerals in the region? That he might be buying the land not for the surface, but for what's underneath it? Edward shrugged. It's possible. Blackwood has always been a shrewd businessman. If he suspected something, he certainly wouldn't divulge his intentions. A new feeling arose in Hope's chest. Not just hope, but also indignation. The idea that Blackwood might be acquiring properties for a fraction of their real value, taking advantage of the ignorance or desperation of the owners, made her blood boil. I need to protect my land, she said firmly. Not just for me, but for my children, and for the other owners who might be being cheated. Edward nodded, admiring her determination. Let's act quickly then. I'll send a sample to my colleague today. In the meantime, I suggest that you maintain absolute discretion about your discovery. Don't talk to anyone, not even close friends. The fewer people who know, the less chance there is of the information reaching Blackwood's ears before we're ready. Before leaving, they agreed on a code to communicate in case it was necessary to send messages. Hope left town that same afternoon, eager to return to her children, carrying with her a complex mixture of hope, apprehension, and a new sense of purpose. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Hope walked along the dirt road leading back to her property. The gentle wind rustled the fields of ripe wheat around her, creating golden waves that extended to the horizon. The bag she carried was lighter without the mineral samples. Edward had kept them to send to his colleague, but her heart and mind were burdened with the weight of new possibilities and responsibilities. She thought of the children, of how their lives could change if the discovery proved to be as valuable as Edward suggested. They could repair the house, buy new tools, maybe even reclaim some of the land sold to pay debts. Lucy could continue her studies beyond the small rural school, and Dylan would have the opportunity to grow up without the deprivations that had marked the last few years. But there were also risks. If Harrison Blackwood discovered what she had found before she could secure her rights, he might find ways to pressure her even more, or worse, to legally challenge the ownership of the mineral resource. Hope knew well the power the man wielded in the region, not only financial but also political. When she finally saw the roof of her house with the smoke from the chimney rising lazily against the twilight sky, she felt a wave of renewed determination. That small house, that piece of land, was more than just a property. It was the legacy of generations, the future of her children, the embodiment of her roots. And now, ironically, it was the very stones beneath that land that could be the key to saving it. The days following Hope's visit to Riverton were marked by a strange duality. Outwardly, she maintained her usual routine, working in the garden, repairing what she could of the damaged roof, preparing meals, caring for the few animals they still possessed. But inwardly, she lived in a constant state of alert, like an animal sensing the approach of a storm before the first clouds even appeared on the horizon. Every unusual noise, every unexpected visitor, every glance that seemed a little longer or more curious left her tense. Was her secret safe? Had Edward received the answer from his university colleague yet? And above all, did Harrison Blackwood suspect anything? On the morning of the 5th day after her return, Lucy found her on the porch, staring intently towards the mountains with a cup of chamomile tea growing cold between her fingers. "Are you waiting for something, Mama?" her ever-observant daughter asked. Hope smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "Just appreciating the view, sweetheart. Sometimes we forget to really look at what's around us." Lucy nodded, though her gaze said she wasn't entirely convinced. "Dylan found something interesting near the creek yesterday. He's saving it to show you later." Hope's heart quickened. "What did he find?" "I'm not sure. He didn't want to show me. He said it was a secret between the two of you." Lucy shrugged, but Hope sensed a trace of hurt in her voice. "Lucy," Hope touched her daughter's shoulder gently, "is something bothering you?" The girl hesitated, her eyes fixed on her own feet. "It's just, lately it seems like everyone has secrets. You've been different since you came back from town. Dylan is hiding things. Even Mrs. Gable acts strangely when I ask about the land on the other side of the creek." Hope felt a pang of guilt. She had been so preoccupied with protecting the children by keeping her secret that she hadn't noticed how her behavior might affect them. "Come," she said, extending her hand. "Let's go for a walk." Together, they walked along the path leading to the fields that once belonged to their family. The day was clear, with just a few scattered clouds in the sky that promised warmth later. Dew still covered the tall grass, wetting the edges of their skirts as they walked. "Do you know why I like this view so much?" Hope asked when they stopped on a small hill that offered a panoramic view of the property and the surrounding land. Lucy shook her head. "Because from here, I can see everything that matters to me," Hope continued. "Our house, the garden we cultivate together, the mesquite tree your grandfather planted the day your father was born, the creek where you and Dylan play. But I can also see beyond, the mountains, the horizon, possibilities." Hope paused, carefully choosing her words. "Everyone has secrets at some point, Lucy, not because we want to exclude those we love, but sometimes because we're trying to protect them, or because we're still trying to understand something ourselves before sharing it." Lucy looked at her with those green eyes so much like her own, filled with a wisdom beyond her years. "You're talking about the visit to Professor Miller, aren't you? About what you found in the creek?" Hope couldn't hide her surprise. "How? I overheard you and Dylan talking about the shiny fragments," Lucy explained. "And then you went to town in such a hurry and came back different, more tense, but also more hopeful." Hope sighed, realizing she had underestimated her daughter's perception. "Yes, I found something that might be valuable, something that could help our family, maybe even save our land, but I'm not sure yet, and that's why I didn't want to create expectations until I knew more." "Is that why Mr. Blackwood wants our land so much? Does he know about whatever it is?" The perspicacity of the question impressed Hope. "I don't know for sure. Maybe. Or maybe it's just a coincidence. That's why we need to be cautious for now." Lucy nodded slowly, processing the information. Then, to Hope's surprise, she took her hand and squeezed it firmly. "I'll help protect our secret, Mama, and I'll keep an eye on Mr. Blackwood when he comes." Hope felt a lump in her throat. Lucy was just a child. She shouldn't be worrying about such things. And yet there she was, offering strength and support like a little adult. It was unfair and touching at the same time. "Thank you, sweetheart. But remember, regardless of what happens with this land or what I found, the most important thing we already have, each other." On the way back to the house, a rider approached on the main road. Hope instinctively pulled Lucy closer, her body tense until she recognized young George, son of one of the neighboring farmers. "Good morning, Mrs. Hope," he called cheerfully, tipping his hat in greeting. "Mrs. Gable asked me to deliver this." She said it arrived for you in town. He extended a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with a simple string. There was no name or address visible, only a small symbol drawn in the corner, a cross inside a circle, the code she and Edward had agreed upon. "Thank you, George," she replied, trying to keep her voice casual as her heart quickened. "How's your family?" They exchanged a few pleasantries, but Hope barely registered the conversation, her mind entirely focused on the package in her hands. Finally, the young man said goodbye and continued on his way. As soon as she entered the house, Hope found a private moment to open the package, while Lucy distracted Dylan in the garden. Inside was only a folded piece of paper. On it, written in Edward's precise handwriting, was a single sentence: "The seed must be planted before the next moon." Coded language, as they had agreed. The seed referred to the documents needed to register the mineral discovery, and the mention of the next moon indicated urgency. Less than a week. This meant that the samples had been confirmed as valuable, possibly more so than Edward had initially suspected. Hope felt a wave of excitement, followed immediately by apprehension. She would need to return to town, but this time she couldn't simply leave the children with Mrs. Gable for a day. The registration process and the necessary meetings would require more time, and with Harrison Blackwood's deadline approaching, each day away from the property was a risk. She sat at the kitchen table, her head in her hands, trying to formulate a plan. It was at this moment that Dylan came running in, his face lit up with childish excitement. "Mama! Mama!" "Look what I found." He extended his closed hand, and when he opened it, it revealed a small, perfectly round stone with a bluish coloration Hope had never seen before. It wasn't one of the mineral fragments she had found earlier. It was something completely different. "It's beautiful, Dylan. Where did you find it?" "Near the big mesquite tree. I was digging a hole to bury my treasure, like the pirates in the stories, and I found several of these." The boy's eyes shone. "Do you think it's magic?" Hope smiled, examining the stone more closely. It didn't seem to have monetary value, but it was certainly unusual. "I don't know if it's magic, sweetheart, but it's special because it's different. Like you." That night, after the children had fallen asleep, Hope went out to the porch. The sky was particularly starry, and the crescent moon bathed the landscape in an almost ghostly silvery light. She thought about Edward's message, the complications that would arise in the coming days, the need to protect the children and her property. A noise at the edge of the woods caught her attention. For a moment, her heart leaped, fearing that someone was spying on the house. But then a fox emerged from the vegetation, its reddish-orange fur almost luminous under the moonlight. The animal stopped, looked directly at Hope as if recognizing her, and then continued on its way with silent elegance. Hope interpreted that appearance as a sign. Nature was reminding her that, like the fox, she would need to be cunning, cautious, and determined. Taking a deep breath of the fresh night air, she made her decision. She would take the children with her to town, not just out of practical necessity, but because they were all in this together, whatever the outcome. Riverton seemed even bigger and busier to Lucy and Dylan's eyes than Hope remembered. The cobblestone streets, the buildings that blended colonial and modern styles, the colorful shop windows, the constant bustle of people and vehicles, everything contributed to a sense of vertigo and excitement in the children, who had rarely strayed from the rural environment they had known since birth. Professor Miller welcomed them with genuine enthusiasm, having prepared simple but comfortable rooms in his house, which was filled with books and curious objects. Dylan immediately fell in love with the collection of minerals and fossils that occupied an entire wall of the living room, while Lucy naturally gravitated towards the shelves overflowing with books on the most diverse subjects. "These little ones have the natural curiosity of true scientists," Edward commented, watching as the children explored the house with wide-eyed wonder. Hope smiled, but the tension was evident on her features. "Did you manage to schedule the meetings you mentioned in the message?" Edward nodded, leading her to his study while the children continued their exploration. "Tomorrow morning we'll meet with Dr. Martinez, my colleague who analyzed the samples. In the afternoon, we have a meeting at the Department of Mineral Resources to begin the preliminary documents for registering the discovery." Hope took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility. "And the results? What did your colleague discover?" Edward smiled, his eyes shining with scientific excitement. "It's confirmed that it's a rare variation of cinnabar, as I initially suspected. But what's most interesting are the veins intertwined with the main mineral. an unusual concentration of mercury, and another element that Martinez believes is almost pure gold. If the vein is as extensive as you described, we're talking about a significantly valuable deposit. Hope felt her legs give way, and she leaned against the desk. The confirmation of the value of her discovery brought not only relief, but also renewed fear. If what was beneath her land was so valuable, Harrison Blackwood's pressure to acquire her property took on a new dimension. "No one else knows about this except us and your colleague, right?" she asked in a low voice. "Absolutely no one," Edward assured her. "Martinez is a completely trustworthy man, and the documents we're preparing are intentionally vague as to the exact location and nature of the deposit." This reassured Hope momentarily, but soon her thoughts returned to another concern. "And about the registration? Will my status as a widowed woman without technical training hinder the process?" Edward frowned, understanding her concern. "Unfortunately, prejudices exist. I can't deny that. But you are the legitimate owner of the land, and the laws are clear regarding the right of discovery. Besides," he added with an encouraging smile, "you have the advantage of having consulted me, an old respected professor whose word still carries some weight in this town." That night, after a simple but substantial dinner, Edward suggested they show the children a bit of the town. The central square, lit by old-fashioned lanterns, hosted a small night fair where local artisans sold their creations. The sound of a guitar came from a cafe on the corner, and the aroma of roasted corn filled the cool night air. Dylan ran from stall to stall, marveling at wooden sculptures, handcrafted toys, and colorful candies, while Lucy walked more contentedly beside Hope, observing everything with attentive and curious eyes. "I never imagined the town could be like this," Lucy commented, her voice almost a whisper. "So full of different things." Hope smiled, squeezing her daughter's hand. "It's very different from our life, isn't it? Louder, busier, more possibilities," Lucy completed, surprising Hope with her choice of words. "Here it seems that people can choose to be anything, do anything." The girl's observation touched Hope deeply. Indeed, the city represented possibilities that rural life often limited: advanced education, culture, a diversity of professions and experiences. But it also brought its own challenges: impersonality, the fast pace, constant competition. "Every place has its charms and its challenges," she finally replied. "The important thing is to be able to choose where we want to be, not to be forced to one place or another by necessity or desperation." Lucy nodded, understanding the depth behind the simple words. "That's why we're fighting for our land, isn't it? To have that choice." "Exactly," Hope confirmed, impressed once again by her daughter's maturity. Returning to Edward's house, they found the professor in his study, bent over documents scattered across the desk, preparing for the next day's meetings. Dylan fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted by the day's excitement. But Lucy stayed awake, browsing an illustrated book on mineralogy that Edward had lent her. Hope took the opportunity to walk to the window, observing the city lights in the distance. She thought about how her life might change in the coming days, depending on the outcome of the meetings. If everything went as she hoped, her discovery would be officially registered, guaranteeing her rights to the minerals on her property. This would not only prevent Harrison Blackwood from taking her land, but would also open up possibilities to significantly improve her family's life. The meeting at the Department of Mineral Resources proved more tense than Hope had anticipated. The official who received them, a middle-aged man named Mr. Ortega, seemed more interested in bureaucratic procedures than in the meaning or value of the discovery itself. "I understand the urgency, but there are protocols to follow," he explained, stamping forms with methodical precision. "Normally, the process of registering a mineral discovery takes 3 to 6 months to be completed." 3 to 6 months? Hope felt her blood run cold. "But that's impossible. My deadline I can't wait that long," Edward intervened, his voice calm but firm. "Mr. Ortega, I know there are provisions for expedited processes in specific cases. Mrs. Hope's discovery possesses characteristics that would justify such treatment, both because of its unusual scientific value and because of the particular circumstances of the discovery." Ortega adjusted his glasses, looking at Edward with a mixture of respect and annoyance. "Professor Miller, I understand your position, but even with an expedited process, we're talking about weeks, not days, and we would need an official assessment from the Geological Department, which means an on-site inspection. Hope exchanged a worried look with Edward. An official inspection would mean exposing the exact location of the discovery, increasing the risk of the information reaching the wrong ears. What if we submitted a complete technical report, endorsed by recognized specialists, Edward suggested. My colleague, Dr. Martinez from the National University, has already conducted preliminary analyses that confirm the exceptional value of the finding. Ortega seemed to consider the proposal. It could work, especially if Dr. Martinez is willing to officially endorse the report. His reputation is impeccable. He paused, tapping his fingers on the table. We would also need documentation proving Mrs. Hope's unequivocal ownership of the land in question. I have all the necessary documents, Hope affirmed, taking from her bag the carefully preserved papers confirming the ownership of her land, passed down from generation to generation. While Ortega examined the documents, Hope noticed his eyes pausing on a specific name. This land borders the property of Mr. Harrison Blackwood. Hope nodded, feeling increasing tension. That's right. In fact, Mr. Blackwood has shown an interest in acquiring my property lately. Something indefinable crossed the official's eyes. I see. That could complicate things. Why? Hope asked, though she suspected the answer. Ortega briefly looked around, as if checking that no one else could hear them. Mr. Blackwood is an influential man in the region. He has friends in important positions, even in this department. It wouldn't be the first time a request mysteriously gets lost when it interferes with his interests. Hope's stomach clenched with a mixture of fear and indignation. Are you saying he could sabotage my request? I'm not saying anything, ma'am, Ortega replied, quickly adopting a formal tone, just commenting that administrative procedures can be complex and occasionally unpredictable. Edward, sensing the danger, intervened again. Mr. Ortega, I trust that you, as a public official, will ensure that this request is treated with the same impartiality and rigor as any other. Mrs. Hope is only seeking to exercise her legitimate rights as an owner. Something in Edward's tone, perhaps the moral authority of a respected academic, seemed to have an effect on Ortega. Of course, Professor, we will do everything according to the regulations. If we receive Dr. Martinez's technical report tomorrow, we could start the expedited process. Hopefully, we would have a preliminary response in 2 weeks. 2 weeks, exactly when Harrison Blackwood's deadline expired. It would be tight, but possible. Leaving the government building, Hope took a deep breath of the afternoon air, trying to calm her nerves. Do you think we can trust him? Edward adjusted his hat, thoughtful. Ortega isn't a bad man, just a cautious one. He's seen enough power plays to know that confronting someone like Blackwood directly could cost him his job, but I think he'll do the right thing, as long as we give him the tools to justify his actions. What tools? Hope asked, as they walked back to Edward's house where the children were waiting under Mrs. Gable's care. Impeccable documentation. Martinez's report must be so exhaustive and technically sound that rejecting it would be indefensible. And perhaps, Edward stopped as if considering whether to share a risky idea. Perhaps we need something more than just scientific backing. What do you mean? Public support. If a certain number of landowners in the region knew that their lands could contain valuable resources, if they understood that they've been selling to Blackwood for a fraction of their real value, well, that would change the landscape. Hope shook her head, alarmed. That would be dangerous. We can't expose the discovery like that. I'm not talking about revealing your specific finding, but creating general awareness. There are other landowners like you pressured to sell without suspecting the true value of what they possess. That night, while the children slept, Hope, Edward and Dr. Martinez worked late into the night preparing the technical report. Martinez, a short, thin man with tireless energy, had brought with him additional analysis results that confirmed the extraordinary value of the mineral. It's fascinating from a scientific perspective, he explained, pointing to graphs and tables full of data. This specific combination of cinnabar with traces of native gold hasn't been documented in this region. If the deposit is confirmed to be extensive, we could be looking at a new type of deposit of global interest. That comment made Hope look up from the papers. Global? What exactly does that mean? Edward and Martinez exchanged glances. It means that international mining companies could be interested, Edward replied cautiously, which could be an advantage or a complication, depending on how we handle the situation. But first things first, Martinez intervened. securing your legal rights to the discovery. Then you can decide how to proceed, whether to exploit the resource yourself through partnerships or to sell the rights under your conditions. The next morning dawned grey and damp, with a persistent drizzle that turned the cobblestone streets into slippery surfaces. Hope woke up early, restless after a night of interrupted sleep. She went to the window and observed the city slowly waking up. Vendors setting up their stalls under colourful awnings, maids shaking rugs from balconies, a milkman driving his cart pulled by an old horse. A world so different from her own, and yet at that moment she felt that their destinies were intertwined in mysterious ways. The decisions she would make in the coming days would not only affect her life and her children's, but could have repercussions for the entire region. A soft noise startled her. Lucy was at the bedroom door watching her. "Good morning, Mama," the girl said, approaching to stand beside her at the window. "Today's the important day, isn't it?" Hope nodded, putting her arm around her daughter's shoulders. "Today we'll give the papers to Mr. Ortega. If everything goes well, we'll have taken the first step to protect our future. What if it doesn't go well?" The direct question, so typical of Lucy, made Hope carefully consider her answer. She could have offered empty assurances, assured her that everything would turn out perfectly, but her daughter deserved the truth, or at least as much of the truth as she could handle. "If it doesn't go well, we'll find another way," she finally replied. "There's always more than one way to solve a problem." Lucy seemed satisfied with that answer, and both remained silent for a moment, contemplating the city under the rain, each lost in her own thoughts. Breakfast was a lively affair, with Dylan excitedly recounting his dreams of treasure-filled caves and pirates, while Edward listened with genuine interest, occasionally adding fascinating facts about real caves and geological formations that made the boy's eyes widen even more. Mid-morning, Hope and Edward set out for the Department of Mineral Resources, carrying with them the meticulously prepared report. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained overcast, threatening to unleash another storm at any moment. Ortega's office seemed smaller and more stifling than the day before, or perhaps it was just Hope's anxiety that altered her perception. The official received them with polite but distant formality, accepting the report with a brief nod. "I will review it personally," he promised, placing it in a drawer of his desk instead of the overflowing inbox, a small gesture that Hope interpreted as favorable. As they left, they ran into a tall, well-dressed man entering the office. His impeccable suit and authoritative bearing contrasted with the modesty of the government building. As he passed them, his eyes paused briefly on Hope, with an appraising look that made her uncomfortable. "Who was that?" she asked Edward once they were outside. The professor frowned, worried. "Javier Blackwood, Harrison's son, the family lawyer, and they say the brains behind the recent expansions of their business." A shiver ran down Hope's spine. "Do you think he recognized us? That he knows why we're here?" "Impossible to know, but his presence here is unsettling. I suggest we accelerate our plans." Back at the house, they found Martinez talking animatedly with Lucy about geology, while Dylan built a precarious tower with books and small boxes. "How did it go?" Martinez asked, immediately noticing the tension on their faces. Edward briefly recounted the encounter with Javier Blackwood, while Hope sat heavily in a chair, suddenly exhausted by the accumulated stress. "This changes things," Martinez said after a moment of reflection. "If the Blackwoods suspect something, we can't rely on the official process to protect us in time." "What do you suggest?" Hope asked. "We need an alternative plan, a backup in case they try to block or delay the official registration." Over the next few hours, the three adults discussed strategies, while the children played in the garden under Mrs. Gable's watchful eye. They considered legal options, potential alliances with other landowners, even the possibility of seeking outside investors who could face the Blackwoods on equal terms. It was Lucy who, unintentionally, provided the key. Entering to get a glass of water, she overheard fragments of the conversation and casually commented, "It's like in the book I'm reading. The most valuable treasure isn't the one that's buried, but the map that shows where to find it." The three adults stared at her, surprised by the accidental perspicacity of her observation. "That's it!" Edward exclaimed, hitting the table with enthusiasm. "We don't need to protect just the mineral, but the knowledge of its existence. A public record would suffice, something that establishes the priority of the discovery without revealing its exact location. Like a scientific publication?" Martinez suggested, already enthusiastic about the idea. "Exactly," A preliminary article in the National Geological Bulletin, specific enough to establish the importance of the finding, but vague enough in terms of location to protect Hope's interests. Once published, any attempt to appropriate the discovery would be clearly fraudulent. Hope felt a spark of hope ignite again. How long would that take? Normally months, but I have some contacts on the editorial committee. Martinez smiled. We could have an emergency publication in next week's edition if we work fast. The next day passed in a frenzy of activity. While Edward kept in touch with Ortega to follow the official process, Martinez and Hope worked on the scientific article, carefully structured to reveal the value of the discovery without compromising its exact location. The children, sensing the importance of the moment, without fully understanding its implications, remained unusually calm and cooperative. Lucy even helped organize notes and draw a schematic map that would serve as an illustration for the article, while Dylan entertained everyone with invented stories about the magical powers of the shiny stones. That night, after sending the finished manuscript to the bulletin, Hope allowed herself a moment of calm. Sitting in the small backyard of Edward's house, under a sky that had finally cleared, revealing a blanket of stars, she reflected on the strange turn her life had taken in such a short time. From being on the verge of losing everything she loved, she now found herself potentially at the gates of a prosperity she had never imagined. And yet what she valued most hadn't changed. Her children healthy and safe, the land of her ancestors still resisting, her own inner strength tested but not broken by adversity. The value of the invisible, that was the lesson she was learning. Not only the mineral hidden beneath the earth, but the human connections, the quiet determination, the knowledge passed down through generations. These were the true riches that no Harrison Blackwood could ever take from her. The news arrived early, with the first rays of sun filtering through the bedroom curtains. Edward rushed in, waving a telegram in his hand, his face lit up with a smile that revealed everything before he could utter a word. "We did it," he exclaimed. "The Bulletin has agreed to publish the article in a special edition. It'll be out the day after tomorrow." Hope, still in her robe and with her hair loose, took the telegram with trembling hands. The official words, brief and direct, confirmed what Edward had just announced. The mineral discovery would be publicly recognized, establishing its priority unequivocally. "And the official registration?" she asked, barely daring to hope for good news on that front as well. Edward's smile faltered slightly. "Ortega says the process is still underway, but he's found some administrative irregularities that need to be resolved. I think he's under pressure, probably from the Blackwoods. Does that mean it's blocked?" "Delayed, not blocked. And with the Bulletin publication, we'll have significant backing. Legally, your discovery will be documented and dated, making any attempt at appropriation difficult." Lucy and Dylan, awakened by the voices, appeared at the bedroom door, rubbing their sleepy eyes. "What's going on?" Lucy asked, always attentive to the adults' shifts in mood. Hope knelt down to be at her children's level, showing them the telegram even though she knew they wouldn't understand its technical content. "Good news. One step closer to protecting our land." "Does that mean we're going home soon?" Dylan asked, whose initial enthusiasm for the city had given way to a growing nostalgia for the open spaces and freedom of their rural home. "Very soon," Hope promised, "maybe in a few days." Over breakfast, they planned the next steps. With the publication secured and the official process underway, though delayed, Hope felt it was time to return to her property. Harrison Blackwood's deadline would expire in 4 days, and she wanted to be there to confront him when he came to demand an answer. "It's risky," Edward opined. "If Blackwood suspects something, he might try more direct measures to pressure you." "All the more reason for me to be there," Hope replied with determination. "I won't let him think I've run away, or that I'm afraid to face him. Besides, I need to make sure the mineral vein is protected." Martinez, who had arrived early to share the celebration, offered an intermediate solution. "I have a nephew, Ramon, who's a mining engineer. He could accompany you, ostensibly as a helper you've hired for repairs on the house. His presence might deter any intimidation." The proposal made sense, and it was agreed that they would leave the next day. The rest of the day was spent in preparations. Edward insisted they take extra supplies, tools, and even a small telescope to observe the stars with the children, although everyone understood its real purpose would be to watch for suspicious movements around the property. That afternoon, while organizing her meager belongings, Hope found Lucy sitting at the small desk in the room, writing intently in a notebook. "What are you writing, sweetheart?" she asked, curious about her daughter's unusual dedication. Lucy looked up, slightly surprised. "A story. About us. The land. The shiny stones." Hope sat beside her, moved. "Can I see it?" With some shyness, Lucy pushed the notebook towards her mother. The pages were filled with careful handwriting, occasionally illustrated with small drawings. The house, the creek, figures representing her family. The story, simple but emotional, recounted their recent adventures from a child's perspective, blending real events with imaginary elements. The fox Hope had seen became a magical guide. The shiny stones granted special powers. The fight against Blackwood took on the tones of an epic battle between heroes and villains. "It's beautiful," Hope said, feeling a lump in her throat. "You should keep writing it. Do you really like it?" Lucy's eyes shone. "I thought it could be a book someday, for other children to read." "I'm sure it will be," Hope assured her, kissing her daughter's forehead. In that small exchange, she saw the future unfolding like a lit path. Lucy with books, education, opportunities she herself had never had. The mineral beneath the earth represented not only financial security, but also possibilities that had previously seemed unattainable. The return trip was less tense than the outward journey, despite the uncertainty they still faced. Ramon, Martinez's nephew, proved to be a pleasant and capable young man who quickly won Dylan's admiration with his stories about mining excavations and his knowledge of the various magic stones they might find. As they approached the property, Hope felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Everything seemed to be in order. The house was still standing. The garden showed signs of recovery after the storm. The few animals grazed peacefully in the afternoon sun. But she also sensed a tension in the air, as if the landscape itself held its breath, awaiting the outcome of the drama unfolding. Mrs. Gable greeted them with exclamations of joy and curious questions about their stay in town. She didn't mention any visits or suspicious movements during their absence, which partially reassured Hope. Perhaps Blackwood hadn't made any connections between their sudden trip and any suspicions about the hidden value of the land. The next 2 days passed in apparent normalcy. Hope and the children resumed their routines, while Ramon, maintaining his facade as a helper, hired for repairs, discreetly examined the mineral vein and took detailed notes on its extent and characteristics. "It's more impressive than I imagined," he commented quietly to Hope, as they ostensibly worked on the roof of the small barn. "From what I can estimate, the vein extends considerably under the hillside. Martinez was right about its exceptional value." On the morning of the third day, the day before the deadline expired, Hope woke up with a sense of finality. Today would be the day. She didn't know exactly how she knew, but the certainty was unshakable. She dressed with special care, choosing her best skirt and blouse, and arranged her hair in a neat bun. If she was going to face Harrison Blackwood, she would do so with all the dignity she could muster. She didn't have to wait long. They had barely finished breakfast when the sound of approaching horses announced visitors. From the window, Hope distinguished Blackwood riding his impressive black horse, accompanied by his son Javier and 2 other men she didn't recognize. "Stay inside," she instructed the children. "Ramon, please take care of them." The young engineer nodded, understanding the gravity of the moment. Lucy briefly hugged her mother, silently conveying strength, while Dylan watched the scene with wide, solemn eyes, unusually quiet. Hope went out to the porch and waited standing tall as the riders dismounted. Harrison Blackwood, a corpulent man in his 60s with a face tanned by the sun and power, advanced towards her with the confidence of someone who rarely encounters opposition. "Good morning, Mrs. Hope," he greeted with false cordiality. "I see you've returned from your trip. Did you enjoy the city?" The seemingly casual tone didn't hide the implicit threat. He knew where she had been, and probably suspected why. "Very instructive, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, keeping her voice firm. "I learned a lot about the value of things." A flash of irritation crossed the landowner's face. "I suppose you know why I'm here. The deadline we agreed on expires tomorrow." "I don't recall agreeing on any deadline, Mr. Blackwood. You imposed it unilaterally." Javier Blackwood stepped forward, his presence elegant but intimidating. "Mrs. Hope, we understand your emotional attachment to this property, but you must understand that my father's offer is more than generous considering the circumstances. The debts you incurred with the bank, now in our possession, I'm aware of my financial obligations, Hope interrupted, surprising herself with her audacity, and I'm also aware of the true value of my land. A tense silence followed her words. The Blackwoods exchanged glances, confirming Hope's suspicions. They knew, or at least suspected, about the mineral. I don't know what you're referring to, Blackwood finally said, abandoning the pretense of cordiality. This land barely produces enough to survive. Its market value is exactly what I've offered. Perhaps on the surface, Hope replied, holding his gaze firmly, but we both know there's more to consider. Javier stepped forward again, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. Mrs. Hope, if you're referring to certain mineral resources, I must warn you that exploration and exploitation require licenses, capital, technical knowledge, resources that you clearly don't possess, but that I can acquire or negotiate on my own terms, she countered, especially now that my discovery is officially registered and will be published in the National Geological Bulletin. This revelation clearly took them by surprise. Blackwood visibly paled, while Javier hardened his expression. That's impossible, Blackwood muttered. Ortega assured us. Mr. Ortega has been very helpful, Hope confirmed, but it seems he doesn't have as much influence on the bulletin as he does in the department. The article about my discovery is being published tomorrow, signed by the renowned Dr. Martinez. The name of the prestigious geologist seemed to have the expected impact. The Blackwoods looked at each other, clearly recalculating their strategy. Fine, Javier finally said, adopting a pragmatic tone. It seems we need to reconsider our approach. If there really are valuable resources on your property, we could discuss a partnership. We would provide the necessary capital and expertise for exploitation, while you would maintain a fair percentage of the profits. It was a significant concession, but Hope perceived the underlying manipulation. A fair percentage would surely mean the minimum amount they could negotiate. I appreciate your offer, she replied calmly, but I prefer to consider all my options. Dr. Martinez has informed me that several mining companies would be interested in a partnership, especially considering the unique nature of the deposit. This time, the surprise on the Blackwoods' faces was unmistakable. They had completely underestimated her moves and connections. Blackwood, regaining his composure, tried a different tactic. Hope, he said, adopting an almost paternal tone. I understand you want what's best for your children, but this is a complicated world, especially for a single woman. Large companies don't always keep their promises, and outsiders rarely understand or respect local traditions. We're from here. We share this land, this history. It was a shrewd argument, appealing to her sense of community and belonging. For a moment, Hope felt doubt creep into her determination, but then she remembered the condescending glances, the unfair offers, the relentless pressure of the past few months. You're right about something, Mr. Blackwood, she conceded. I want what's best for my children and for this land that has been in my family for generations, and that's precisely why I can't accept your offer under the current terms. She straightened even more, finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. I propose this. When I have all the technical evaluations and alternative offers, I will seriously consider the possibility of a local partnership, provided the terms are truly equitable. In the meantime, the debts to you will be paid with the first income from any agreement I sign. The Blackwoods seemed disconcerted by this unexpected turn. They expected desperation, submission, or at worst, weak and uninformed resistance. Instead, they faced a woman who spoke with the confidence of someone who knows her worth and has secured her position. This conversation isn't over, Blackwood finally said, his tone a mixture of threat and reluctant respect. We'll talk again when you've reconsidered your position. You're always welcome at my house, Hope replied, allowing herself a small smile. The coffee will be ready. She watched them mount and ride away, maintaining her dignified posture until they disappeared into the distance. Only then did she allow her shoulders to relax, releasing the accumulated tension. Turning towards the house, she found Lucy, Dylan, and Ramon watching her from the window, their faces lit up with expressions ranging from pride and admiration to childish wonder. "Mama, you were incredible," Dylan exclaimed, running to hug her. "You beat the bad guys," Hope laughed, lifting him into her arms even though he was almost too big for that. "They're not bad guys, sweetheart. Just people who forgot that true value isn't always in what you can see at first glance." Lucy approached more slowly, her green eyes shining with contained emotion. "Are we really going to stay? Forever?" "This is our land," Hope confirmed, extending an arm to include her in the hug. The place where we put down roots, where we grow, where we build our dreams. No one will take it from us. Ramon, observing the scene with respect, commented, "Martinez was right about you, Mrs. Hope. He said you had more grit than many men he's known." She smiled, feeling a mixture of humility and pride. "I just did what any mother would do, protect her children and her legacy." That night, while the children slept and Ramon kept watch discreetly from the repaired barn, Hope went out to contemplate her land under the light of the almost full moon. The creek reflected the silvery light, and in the distance, the mountains stood like protective giants. Her mind wandered to the future, not with anxiety, but with a cautious hope. There would be challenges, no doubt. Complex negotiations, technical decisions, balancing mineral exploitation with land preservation. But for the first time in years, she felt she had options. Control over her destiny and that of her children. The mineral beneath the earth was valuable, yes, but Hope now understood that the true wealth lay in the invisible. Determination, dignity, family ties, knowledge passed down through generations, the ability to stand firm when everything seems lost. As she slowly returned to the house, her footsteps resonating softly on the earth that held so many stories, a deep certainty took root in her heart. This land of silence, this land of struggle, was now finally a land of promise. My friends, we've reached the end of the story. Did you enjoy it? What lesson can you take from this story? Leave it here in the comments. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and watch this video that's playing on your screen. This story will impact you. Until next time.